the December 5th, 2019 Planning Commission meeting. Mr. Kane, will you call roll?
Daly. Friedrich.
Here.
Honig.
Here.
Horgan. Irwin.
Here.
Kostreva.
Here.
Leash.
Here.
Ortman. Rise. Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is approval of the agenda.
Move to approve the agenda. Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is approval of the November 7th, 2019 regular meeting minutes.
Move to approve the agenda, or the minutes as presented.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is approval of the November 7th, 2019 work session minutes.
Move to approve the minutes from the work session. Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is Zoning Board of Appeals report. Commissioner Friedrich?
Madam Chair, we did not meet.
Thank you. And next item on the agenda is communications. Mr. Kane?
Madam Chair, you had one communication tonight, which was in your packet, which was from Doug LaBelle.
Thank you. And next item on the agenda is public comment. If anyone from the public would like to comment, now would be your opportunity to do so.
You're good? Hello, I'm Kevin Keating. I'm the president of the Home Builders Association of Central Michigan, and I'm here on behalf of our 435 members to try to find a way to work through some of the issues that they've been having with the new zoning ordinance, specifically with relation to the garage setbacks and orientation, the roof pitch, which I recognize you have worked on a little bit, and the City Commission has worked on a little bit. We think that there is some more things that could be discussed with that. We just wanted to see if we find a way that we can kind of have more of an open dialogue to kind of work through some of the things that the Home Builder Association has been bringing to the City Commission and to the Planning Commission.
Thank you.
Good evening. Carmelina Creasy, I'm the CEO for the Home Builders Association. And kind of reiterating what Kevin Keating said, our president of the Home Builders Association, just here in terms of the ordinance and in specific, the section of the ordinance that we're looking at right now is the orientation of the garage and many of the issues that it's creating. You know, we are in hopes that that would be reviewed, and it was at the City Commission meeting, and they charged the Planning Commission with dealing with this once again. So we're once again here hoping that you would take a look at that and see if that could be possibly changed.
Thank you.
Doug LaBelle, 955 Meadowbrook Drive. I think most of my comments have been documented in your packets over the last few months. There's really not much else to say other than those at some point need to be addressed. I'm not sure if they will be. Some of them have. The minor ones have. The ones that are preventing development and creating tax base in the city have not been addressed. If the city would like to increase the tax base, those will need to be addressed. In my most recent correspondence, I think it was November 4th, that had the building permits in there. Now, again, that was only 9 months of the 12. You can see a considerable drop in the building permits. I mean, I don't have any other facts other than that's it. I don't know if it's directly related to the ordinance, but if you look at the trend in the previous 5 years, the only thing that's changed is the ordinance. So that to me is a direct correlation. There might be some other factors, but to me that would be one of the main factors of why these permits there's less permits being issued, less people wanting to do stuff because they're choosing not to because of the new ordinance or because of the costs associated with the new ordinance. So just encourage you, the City Commission has put some of these items back onto your plate. Just encourage you to really look through it, analyze it, what's in there that we need to change for the betterment of the community. It's a community effort, it's nonpartisan, it's a community effort. We've got to put differences aside, and we need to make sure that we do what's best for the community. How do we raise tax base? If you don't want to raise tax base, then you're doing just fine. But if you want to raise tax base, only if you want to, and to grow the community and make this a better place to live, then that's what we need to do. Now, I went through that whole packet, that economic study. There's a lot of great things in there. How do we achieve all that? I don't know, but there's gonna have to be, if we get all these incentives to get more single families over in that student area, well, then those become homestead, the taxes are going down. So how do we offset some of those things, wants that we want, but at the same time, we need to have some development to be able to offset some of that. So, again, we've been here wanting to work together, trying to come up with some ideas. We'd like some solutions to some of our concerns, as well as the rest of the community, as my emails have shown. As I said, I've spoken with many other business people that, you know, are not wanting to put their name out there for fear of some retaliation or retribution. So they're not comfortable putting their name out there. The ones that I was able to share are the ones that consented to that. The other ones did not, which I'd say there was probably about 25 or 30 that wouldn't consent to me using their name. So I'm just encouraging you to, I appreciate what you guys do, ladies too, appreciate what you do. You're serving. Anything you can do to help bridge that gap to create some more tax base and allow some growth and allow some more development would be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. And seeing no one else that could make public comment, I'm closing public comment. Next item on the agenda is new business, the 2019 housing report. Mr. Kane?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to bring this item forward to the Planning Commission for your information. The City Commission and their goal setting for 2019, one of the 3 goals they set was for an analysis to be done of the city's housing stock with some particular emphasis on a few items. One, looking at the type of dwellings that exist in the city, the number of units of each of those dwelling types, and the occupancy of those types, what the trends in owner occupancy have been in the community, and to identify if there's any gaps in that market and any programs, whether they're incentive programs or policy programs that the city could implement in order to address any of those identified gaps. I'm not going to go through everything that's in the report for the sake of time, but I do want to point out a couple of highlights and encourage you, if you haven't already, to take a peek through the report. It's pretty succinct considering the amount of information it covers, but there were a number of things that we found in the research that I thought were interesting that might be interesting to you as well. Some of them not specifically related to housing, but that impact housing. And those are the things I wanted to highlight. So the first is on page 2. I just point out there's a table there showing the number of units that exist in the city by the type of dwelling. We spent a lot of time, and I'm sure you've all seen a lot of articles in your planning magazines and whatnot about missing middle housing over the last several years. This is the first time we've actually looked at the city's housing stock to see exactly what housing we have in those missing middle typologies. And you'll see the whole idea of missing middle is that these are housing types that are in fact missing in the supply of housing in communities around the country. And you'll see that's largely true in Mount Pleasant as well. We have a tremendous amount of housing in 2 categories, detached single-family houses and in multi-unit complexes. And then the vast majority of other housing types are largely non-existent or in very, very small supply in the city's overall housing stock. We've got about 8,300 housing units in the city, and you're going to see that the vast majority, over 3,000 each, are in either multi-unit, large apartment complexes or in houses. Other thing I'd just point out in terms of owner occupancy, because we hear a lot about that and have over the last several years, this report didn't just look at overall owner occupancy rates for housing units in the city, which would include every type of housing unit, including apartments. Going back to that table, obviously when, about 40% of your housing units are in apartment complexes, that's going to have a significant impact on your owner occupancy rate, because for the most part, apartment complexes aren't owner occupied units. So we actually looked at just for homes, so those detached houses, and when you look at detached houses, you find that you'll find that the owner occupancy rate in the city actually jumps pretty significantly above the census listed rate, which is currently at 39.1%. That's particularly true in certain neighborhoods of the community. So in the east side neighborhoods and in the southwest neighborhood, you're going to find occupancy rates that are 80 to 90%.
Jacob, that's
Yes.
owner occupied, is that?
Correct, yep, owner occupied. Some other things I thought were interesting, looking at the population and trying to drill down into, questions about how much of the city's population is attributable to the university population, and looking at census data, it appears that about 50% of the city residents, so our 26,000 residents, about 50% of them are university students, about half of those residing on campus and half of those residing off campus within city limits. So pretty significant number, leaves about 13,000 residents within the city population that are not directly affiliated with the university as students. We also looked at our poverty rate. We know that our poverty rate by the census numbers is quite high. We also have known for a long time that the university population was likely a huge contributor to that poverty rate. So we were able to find a methodology that was developed by the University of Virginia in coordination with the Census Bureau to adjust poverty rates in communities like ours where there is a factor at play in increasing that poverty rate, to do an adjustment. And so doing that adjusted poverty rate, we find it essentially cuts our poverty rate in half from just under 40% to just under 20%. And then finally, looking at the age of the community, again, being a college community, it's not a surprise that we have a fairly low median age. But I thought it was fascinating that the significant portion of our population, almost 70%, are folks that were born since 1981. So we actually have a very young community, and a significant portion of that young part of our community is not necessarily college aged, whether they're folks that are young professionals or folks that are not yet in college. It was also one of the few demographics that we saw, a demographic we saw a big increase in the last 17 years, is that young professional group, a 22% increase in their population in our community over that period. So there's been a lot of talk about strategies to attract those folks to the community, and it appears for whatever reason that percentage of the population is growing. The report makes some recommendations for the city to consider in order to address some of the items that are some of the findings of the report. One of those relates to multiple family housing densities, and I will likely bring an item forward in 2020 for your consideration that would address that particular element, and we could go into that in more detail at that time. So if you read nothing else in the report, on page 6, you might want to take a peek at that bullet under removing barriers to missing middle housing, the first bullet. That would be one item within the purview of the Planning Commission that we'll likely talk about at some point in the next year. So with that, like I said, there's a lot of information in here, a tremendous amount of data. Most of the data that was staff generated was generated with a date of January 2019. So it's all relatively, at this point, should be pretty close to accurate to today's conditions, plus or minus a few units. And I'd welcome any questions anybody might have at this time.
I have one that's kind of tangentially related. Have we been given building permit figures for the last few years?
It would have been attached to a previous packet in a correspondence.
Okay, so obviously this year isn't done yet, but are the permits that were issued by the city of Mount Pleasant down significantly from last year or the year before?
I wouldn't classify it that way. I think if you're interested in learning more about permit figures, it might be beneficial to have Brian Kench, our building official, in to talk to you about those.
Okay, well, is it possible that those figures could be given to everybody here
Yeah,
at
they
some
would have been
point?
in your previous packet, so.
Well, is it something that's done once a year?
It was like
It was
October,
sent as
November
part of a
packet.
correspondence.
Okay, all right.
I have a clarifying question. When looking at the analysis of the housing, some of our houses for, I'm thinking more of like student rentals, I'm wondering where they fell in the category of the count of houses that are rentals where they rent the main floor as a house, but then some of them will rent the basement as a separate unit. Are those considered like a single-family rental, or is that considered a duplex at that point?
It depends on how many units are within the structure. So there's a variety of configurations for 1, or for 2, 3, 4 unit housing. This report is going to look at essentially the breaking point was if you had a structure on a lot, so 1 structure per lot, then it was likely going to be classified as a house, a duplex, a triplex, or a fourplex. When you started to have aggregations of those housing types on a single lot, so something like a condominium complex where you've got a lot of common area and several 2 or 4 unit dwellings, then it would have been classified as a multi-unit complex. We didn't get, it's not that granular in terms of where the units are within the structure, in part because we don't have that data for the most part to know exactly how things are broken down, especially if the units were created not created recently, then we're definitely not going to have that data in our files. The closest we could get, if you're getting to like student type housing, is on page 9. You'll see we do break out the number of units in each housing type that are rooming status. So these are dwellings where there's a unit that's licensed for 3 or more people. So you can see how that breaks out across the different types of housing. So for instance, there's slightly more duplexes, duplex style dwellings that are rooming status than there are houses that are rooming status. And those rooming status duplexes are a larger proportion of the overall duplexes than the rooming style houses are the overall proportion of houses. That's in part when you drill down, even for older homes that were converted to rooming dwellings, several years ago. Many of those were divided into units, and then those units became rooming dwellings. So that was a pretty common approach at those times. There's not as many homes that were just licensed as a rooming dwelling with a larger occupancy without any of that subdivision occurring. So I don't know if I can't really answer that question, but hopefully that provides some context.
Is the units for the living units on campus, are they part of the 8,300, or is
No.
that different? Okay.
They are not. These are just publicly available housing units. So this would exclude any of the congregate type housing that would exist in the community, whether it was in a nursing home or a dormitory or anything like that. That's not going to show up on these numbers.
I was talking about this with Alexis, and she said she knew people who had better than the median income that were trying to find a place to rent and just couldn't find anything but junk. I mean, they could pay, they just couldn't. And it was very, very hard for them to find. I suppose in at least one case, and you can't take a thing just that's the case and that's the truth. Would have loved to have a reasonable enough home to rent for a year or two, but just had a very, very hard time locating that. I think that's slightly different than the problem, but you said there was not a great amount of stock for more than median income folk, I think. Isn't that one of your findings?
Essentially, looking at household incomes and what is affordable to households. Higher income households can obviously afford to pay a larger rent or mortgage payment, and so running those numbers, it looked like the larger gaps in the market were at the extreme ends.
Right.
So folks with very, very low incomes, sub $20,000 a year, and folks with higher incomes in the community over $75,000, there aren't nearly as many units that are priced for the amount of rent or mortgage that those incomes can support.
And I was interested to find, I think I half knew this, that this abandonment of a thing called a middle has been going on for a long time across the country.
Absolutely. I mean, this is not unique to Mount Pleasant. If anything, we probably have a slightly more balanced housing stock than many communities, in part just by virtue of being a college community. So there's a lot more housing stock diversity here than I think you would find in a lot of suburban communities around the state, for certain. But it was pretty typical around the 1950s, 1960s for communities to begin squeezing out these uses, like accessory units, the duplexes, triplexes, and if not squeezing them out through a direct prohibition, then indirectly prohibiting them, because if you
Space.
require 16 parking spaces for a
Frontage.
fourplex, then a fourplex on a residential neighborhood no longer makes sense.
And it was Minneapolis that recently got rid of single-family owner-occupied zoning areas, or,
Correct.
okay,
Yep.
scary stuff.
Any other questions on the housing report?
Yeah, where are the areas where we are overstocked?
It appears the kind of the bracket of income for, let's say, moderate income rental housing, there's about twice the supply as there would be households. And my conjecture on that is that there's a lot of our lower and very low income households are going to be student households, just by nature of how their income's reported. And they luckily can afford more rent than their income would indicate.
right.
And so they're probably being serviced by that surplus of units. But this
Oh,
report
okay, yeah.
wouldn't really indicate that we have any huge surpluses. We don't really have any huge deficits either. The deficits we have seem to be relatively modest, but again, at the extremes.
Yeah, and I can appreciate the difficulty in working your statistics when you've got this odd, large student population, which doesn't adhere to a lot of rules of thumb, what they can afford and what they're doing here and how much money they make, and is that really poverty and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, the folks who do this professionally, who do market analysis for housing, will tell you they would rather not do a housing study in a college community because it is really difficult. There's a lot of conditions overlapping that are hard to figure out.
I'd be interested in the three professionals' opinion in front of us here, you three, as to whether there is a shortage of any one of these categories, particularly sort of like the high-end family coming in making $75,000 a year, and they don't want to own, they want to rent. Will they be able to find a decent home in Mount Pleasant, or is it really, I'm sure that you deal with this every day.
In addition to being president of the Home Builders Association, I'm a realtor with Coldwell Banker Mount Pleasant Realty, where I've been since 2005. And I can tell you, professionals coming in, coaches, professors, medical professionals, whatever, there is no place for them to rent. And there is a serious lack of homes for them to buy. So yeah, that's one of the other concerns, I think, with, if this zoning ordinance, which we believe is slowing down some of the new construction for some of those homes in the city, we want to see if we can find a way to alleviate that, because, that's a pretty big tax base for each of those homes, and we want those people in Mount Pleasant. We don't really have any high-end rentals here. A lot of them are going to Midland, where they do have a better,
Really?
higher-end market for that. We'd rather have them here, though.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Doug LaBelle Realty. I would totally agree with Mr. Keating. I would also have one actual experience that happened. I moved back here about 5 years ago, and we didn't really want to buy a house right away. We didn't really know if we were going to, if if moving here was gonna be the right fit for us. You know, I'd lived in Phoenix the previous 15 years, you know, doing a new career, all that stuff, didn't know, we just had some uncertainty, so we preferred to rent. You know, we were looking for a home for my wife and our 2 young daughters, and in a neighborhood that was, you know, maybe, if you wanna call it upper class, I don't know what you wanna call it, but just a nicer end home, you know, probably that $250,000 to $300,000 house. I couldn't find one. I mean, there was about 2 or 3 that were actually for sale that I tried to get with them to try to rent it, and only one was willing to do that. But that's only because I had a friend get involved, because I was a realtor and I couldn't. So I had a friend get involved and reach out to the owner so that way we could go that route. In the long run, they were willing to rent the house to me, but there wasn't much available, is I guess what I'm trying to say. Thank you.
Jacob, what did we get by, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead,
That's
ma'am.
okay. I just wanted to make mention, again, Carmelina, the Chief Executive Officer for the Home Builders Association, just to kind of add to this conversation a little bit, that due to these, some of the ramifications of the ordinance, it's been brought to my attention, of course, that there's been literally 2 new builds in the last 2 years due to a lot of the restrictions from the ordinance. And so, going back to what you were saying, is there ample, you know, rental or housing for people of that, that area of income? But with 2 new builds, kind of gives you an idea that people aren't really looking to want to build. Our builders, subcontractors, are not really looking to build in the city of Mount Pleasant with a lot of the restrictions currently with the ordinance that's in place. So just wanted to bring that back to your attention.
Just gonna add, as 6 years ago, my family, we relocated back to Mount Pleasant, and even at that time, coming in a similar situation of trying to find something quickly, as a rental basis versus buying right away. And at the time coming in October, we had the option of 2 houses or 1 apartment complex to choose from in the entire city, because of most of the rental options were based on student year rental agreements. So we were a couple months past that, and didn't really want to live in the midst of college students in a student housing kind of apartment complex. And the other 2 were houses that were quite far spread out of the city. But we were able to find, I mean, but we ended up, in order to find something, we did need to find assistance with a realtor for finding even those apartments for that one option of that. So I would also agree with that. For that, the person that is not a student, looking for a rental option that has like a lease option, or a family, or you know, coming in, that would be something that I think we could look at helping to meet that need in our community.
I would certainly agree, there is not a lot of options for people to find rentals that aren't really geared towards students. I did want to note, when people are selling like their primary residence and there's a mortgage on it, there's an acceleration clause, which is why they can't rent it out unless the mortgage company consents to it. But that certainly limits rental options as far as single-family houses go.
Do we know how much a house could or would rent for in the city of Mount Pleasant? Maybe someone in the audience might be able to answer that.
12, 14?
Seems like the devil's in the details with that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it just, if it's in the student rental neighborhood, a lot of it's gonna depend on, you know, how many beds does it have? You know, what's the location? Is it a newer or older ones? Some of the newer ones that have been developed are beautiful units, and you can, you know, people want to live there. Some of the more dilapidated ones that maybe they haven't been able to update, they're not as desirable, so you can't get as much for those. You know, I wish my brother Brandon was here. He could speak very, very clearly on that. I mean, I would say a lot of it just depends on, you know, how many beds does it have, but you're looking probably, you know, $400 to $500 a bed. I mean, again, it just depends. It could be 350, depending on the place. Could be upwards of 550, again, depending on location, but I would say probably in that 400 to 500. You know, there could be some places maybe more than that, but,
But what about like a single-family home that's not geared towards students?
well, yeah, that's the tougher one to find, especially, you know, south of High Street, because that's primarily student area, but if you're looking, there's just not a lot of that available. And if it's a rental, that's mainly geared towards students, but if it's zoned single-family, then you can't get as much for it, and therefore an investor wouldn't buy it, because there's not enough return on it. So, I'm not sure that directly answers your question, but an investor wouldn't buy it if he can't get the right amount for it.
What would be the right amount?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you buy it for. So, I mean, if you bought it for 200,000, then the rent's gonna be a lot higher. If you bought it for 100,000, the rent's gonna be lower. So the
Okay,
rent's,
so what would the rent be if it's $200,000?
oh, I'd have to run the numbers. We've got a formula that we do. We plug it all in and, you know, plug in the taxes, the service, and all the stuff that we have to do to be able to come up with what can we pay for it based on what we think we can get in rent. So if it's only allows two unrelated, which is a single-family home, if you got 400 a bed, then you can only get $800 for that. So it doesn't take you long to do the math that you can't pay 200,000 for a house like that. So it'd probably have to be closer to the 75 to 100,000, probably 75,000 or so would be my best guess without having my formula in front of me to run through it.
No, I owned a LaBelle house from long ago, I'm sure, down on Concourse.
Oh, yeah.
Did you grow up there?
I was born, lived there for a few months. So.
And a couple of years ago, we were still, I mean, when I moved into town, we were renting that for $1,200. It's a 3-bedroom ranch with 1.5 baths. And I think it was, we could have got 14. I mean, one of the times we put it out on the market, we had 25 applicants
Yeah, and
in a day. And it's not, I mean, it's just, you should see the house now because it's amazing. The people who bought it, they've just done amazing work, but, yeah.
But, okay, but if you had a, say, a $200,000 house in the city, and you wouldn't have your principal residence tax exemption, your taxes and insurance and whatnot, it's gonna cost you $6 to $8 grand a year. So you're gonna have to get in a big whack and rent just to even think about building a house for rental.
180,
well, we've got
200 a month?
the increased rental fees and inspection fees and all that stuff as well as adding to the cost. So not helping, you know, being able to lease it for a, you know, decent amount or
And your insurance is,
reasonable amount.
So you're not gonna get a bank loan, someone would have to do this with their own cash, and it really wouldn't make sense.
probably, I don't know that a bank is really interested in.
I can tell you they're not, so.
I don't know how fruitful continuing this conversation will be at this point tonight, but one of the things that's lost within this conversation is when you look at these different kinds of housing units like you have on page 9, it's also besides just single-family housing. Like I know a lot of people who work at CMU who don't necessarily want that single-family house to rent, but they do want to rent a condo or a townhouse. They may have come from other parts of the country, have different visions for, maybe they don't like to mow the lawn and things like that without having some of the condos that we do see as far as the design of the built environment. And so that's something, as we look at housing, as we keep on thinking about different diversity of housing outside of what we've been talking about tonight.
Any other comments? Next item on the agenda is staff report, administrative review report. Mr. Kane?
Yeah, we had one staff review for November, which was for Resco, which is located at 1640 Gover Parkway. They are adding a pretty large concrete pad there to provide additional semi-truck storage for their business. And I can move on. For January, we will have a special use permit and site plan review for a new medical marijuana grow facility on Pickard Street. We will also have a special use permit request for a rooming dwelling to increase occupancy of an existing rooming dwelling on South Washington Street. Those are the two cases that I'm confident will be coming in. Our deadline's not for another week and a half, so.
Thank you. Any questions? Is there a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Meeting adjourned.